Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning into this session, which promises so much. My name is Hall Greenland. I'll just kick things off. I'm the president of Friends of Callan Park, some of you may know. And I'd just like to kick things off by acknowledging that Callan Park, and many of us tuning in today, is on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their custodianship of the lands in which we are fortunate enough to live and work, and have Callan Park in such a wonderful, unique site. So the program this afternoon kicks off with a few words from our local member, Jamie Parker, who will be no stranger to most of you, and especially if you've been involved, as Jamie has for the last 2 decades, in protecting and securing Callan Park.
Started very young, Hall, very young.
You're in short pants almost, but not knee high to a grasshopper. Okay, but Jamie, I'll just throw it to you to say a few remarks to kick off this afternoon. Jamie Parker.
Thank you, Hall. Just by way, I'll just be doing a brief introduction and highlighting how people should be contributing to the landscape structure plan. But I too wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners. The land that I'm on is the land of the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. Look, you're for a real treat today. It's great to see Sarah and Stephen here. I've heard Sarah present before, and she's amazing. And I'm really encouraged to hear what Stephen has to say. Gaps maybe is more appropriate. But what I wanted to do is just say 2 brief things. First of all, thank you to the Friends of Callan Park. While people are just tuning in, I was talking to some friends just a few days ago saying, well, if the Friends of Callan Park hadn't come into existence, what would be there at Callan Park? And we were thinking, there'd probably be something like the Callan Park Towers, or maybe where the business park is, the little garden called the Callan Park Reserve. So, to have Callan Park as Callan Park, and obviously Broughton Hall, is incredibly important to all of us. And it's a testament to the Friends of Callan Park. And today is so important because, the victors write history, don't they? And the Friends of Callan Park should be writing a lot of history because of the victories that they've had on that space. And I wanted just to encourage all of you, you may have heard that recently we won $10 million in funding for Callan Park, on top of $2.4 million per annum for the maintenance and functioning of Callan Park. That's almost $1 million more than we had just a year and a half ago per year. Now that money is really important, and we want to start to not only improve the landscape, but also look at repairing some of these incredible heritage landscapes and buildings. So I want to encourage you to go to the Friends of Callan Park website, where you can find out all the details, because the date for submissions closing is imminent. So I encourage you all, just after this, to go and check out the Friends of Callan Park website, have a look and make a quick submission so that your voice can be heard. So can I just conclude by thanking all of you for being so interested, for coming along to this event as part of this very important History Week. And I look forward myself as well to learning something more this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Just a bit of housekeeping before I throw it to Rosalind Burge, who will introduce the speakers. We hope there'll be some lively Q&A, but it's easier on Zoom, as many of you will know, if you use the chat function down below to pose your questions, and then at the end of the presentations, we can go to those questions that are in chat. So that would be easier than waving your hand or whatever, which is hard. So, all right, thanks very much, Jamie, and thank you, Cynthia, for organising this. I'll now throw it to Rosalind to introduce the speakers and get proceedings going. Rosalind.
Thank you, Hall. And in this somewhat disembodied world, it seems very strange not to be able to say welcome both to Stephen and Sarah. We're very grateful to you both giving up your time. There's something special about coming to Callan Park and being there in person, but we're thrilled to have you both. Stephen is our first speaker, and I should also just mention that you'll see by the red dot in the top corner of your screen that this is being recorded too for Friends of Callan Park. Stephen is President of the History Council of New South Wales and Senior Curator and Head of Research at the Australian National Maritime Museum. In 2008, Stephen's book, The Sydney Wars, Conflict in the Early Colony, 1788 to 1817, was published. And a month later, the precious map of Sydney Harbour, drawn by William Bradley, showing Bloody Point, which you'll all know is but a few hundred metres from Burton Hall and Callan Park, came to the museum. Through Stephen's great generosity, the Maritime Museum lent that map, that very special map, to Callan Park, delivering an international coup for its outdoor exhibition, which we installed for History Week 2 years ago and is still standing in Broughton Hall, thanks also to Garth Popple, who I see is present this afternoon. Today, I'll pass to Stephen. He'll consider the value of community history. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Rosalind. I'd also like to acknowledge from where I am in sunny Marrickville, the Gadigal, Wongal and Bidjigal people before we start. And I'd like to say thanks heaps to the Friends of Callan Park for your support for History Week over many years. So thank you very, very much from the History Council. So before I begin, firstly, you're all probably much more expert on the history of Callan Park than I am. I'm sure you are. And probably my knowledge of Callan Park comes from your efforts more than anything else, I'd like to say. But I hope that you'll wait for Sarah's talk that's going to be more focused on Callan Park itself. I thought I'd sort of, in line with History Week, go a bit broader and talk about the value of history as one of the focuses of my talk, but also perhaps I will go over a little bit of what you may already know about the connections or the closeness of the Callan Park site to sites that I've been interested in conflict in the early colony. So I want to talk about heritage sites as part of a broader heritage landscapes, about how history has no local council boundaries, but it's interlinked across landscapes and across communities, and that this, for me at least, is really, really important. Now, if I can share my screen. And you should be able to see the value of history statement. So just a little background on this, because I guess this is where History Week, the theme for History Week, really comes from. So the value of history statement, it began in the United States, which was where it first came to the attention of history councils around Australia. A couple of years ago, I guess a lot of public historians were concerned about the uses and abuses of history in the present. You probably get the bigger picture. Also, academic historians in the States were concerned about the study of history as well. And so they sort of came together and produced a statement about history. And it was inspiring to the various history councils around Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia. And we came up with, over the last couple of years, a collaborative statement which we called The Value of History. And I've just got up on the screen there the very first section of it. And I've just pulled out, there's 7 points where it makes an argument about the importance of history in our daily lives, in our economies, in our identities, our communities, and how history inspires. And I was actually thinking about this today, about how much every day history is embedded in what we do. We just walk around looking at the past every single day. it's just something that we often just take for granted, but it informs everything we do, I think, every day. And I pulled out the one there, strong communities, because I think that's really critical. It's about communities don't exist without common histories. So I think this statement, I think, is a really good thing to go to. It's also up on the History Council's web page for endorsement. So if you have a look at it on the New South Wales History Council website, have a think about endorsing the statement. There's some wonderful endorsements. The other aspect of this statement, just quickly, is it's designed for large organisations, but also for small organisations to help them argue against or argue their case in terms of funding for local groups, to give them some substance that connects with a state and various state and a national voice about the importance of history. And I think, things like the economic elements where history is vital, where a heritage landscape is actually an economic asset, I think is a really strong backup for arguments for local history groups, for local heritage societies, for local site, people caring for local sites, that they need these strong arguments and these arguments that connect with the history field. And that's one of the things the History Council is really on about. So I'm going to, so I just wanted to also, just to connect this with History Week, this statement we released last year in 2019, and we cast around every year, I think it's 25 years of History Week, we cast around every year for a different theme, and bring out the statement last year, the value of history, got us thinking about tying in History Week to consider that. And that's why we came up with the History Week theme, history, what is it good for? And it's not, well, you could answer it, absolutely nothing, but it's meant to be, to get you to consider that it's actually not. It's the opposite of absolutely nothing. There's so many things that it's good for. So what I wanted to do in this talk was to go to a couple of elements, incidents one that I wrote about in my book, and one that Rosalind mentioned just came up afterwards, and to kind of connect these to Callan Park, but to local histories. So the Sydney Wars, and hopefully everyone's familiar. And before this, Jamie Parker said that he hadn't read my book and he'd just come across it. So I'm actually, going to have to really consider my next vote in the next election. But anyway, if you haven't read the book, The Sydney Wars, please do. Or you can actually get a cheats view on my blog post, thesydneywars.com. But essentially, what I wanted to do with this was what I'm arguing here, really, which is a lot of the histories that there's so many early colonial Sydney histories, and a lot of them are kind of, I guess, disconnected in many ways. And there's been a lot of great local history work and a lot of big picture academic work around the Sydney region in that early colonial period. But there hasn't been a connection of the resistance warfare as a kind of military history that I was making in this book. And that's why I ended up with the Sydney Wars as the title, which includes the Hawkesbury Wars, the 1816 campaigns, and various other elements that occurred during that almost 30-year period, and right across Sydney. But it's ringed, it's defined by landscape. that really got me thinking about why this angle was different to perhaps what other people had been doing. And it was really, I was struck, I guess I had been struck by, you know, from growing up in Western Sydney and watching it disappear underneath my feet, but by the landscape of the Cumberland Plain and the significance of it being ringed by the Blue Mountains. And as a school child, you probably all are familiar with the refrain of the three great explorers crossing the impenetrable Blue Mountains. Well, I totally flipped that idea, and I see, and I don't just see it now as a refuge to Indigenous warriors, but I was struck by European accounts of describing the way that a guerrilla warfare campaign was conducted, and it was so annoying that this range of mountains and rugged terrain around Sydney was a harbour, a safe harbour for Aboriginal people raiding on the farms on the edge of the settlements. So it got me thinking about the Blue Mountains, which is, you know, a wonderful place where I've done lots and lots of bushwalking, as a place of refuge, as a place of safety, and not as an impenetrable barrier to be conquered, but as something completely the opposite. So that's where the Sydney Wars germinated, I suppose. And one of the things I just wanted to show here was the other element about this terrain and landscape. If you look at the mapping of Macquarie's 1816 campaigns, which resulted in the Appin massacre, which I hope you're all familiar with, which is Sydney's massacre history. The main massacre that occurred, there were several down south in Appin. And if you start to map, and that's what the previous slide was meant to show as well, if you start to map the conflict and the campaigns, you really begin to see clearly the extent of the resistance and the counter actions against the resistance warfare, particularly in the 1816 campaigns, where Macquarie mobilises the largest military force the colony had seen to conduct these sweeping campaigns. And if you look to the mid-section on the west, the main reason, in my opinion, that Macquarie does this is to secure the new road in 1815 that had been established by Cox across to the Bathurst Plains, which was going to be, which was the jewel, the saviour of the colony, the future progress. And Macquarie knew in 1816 there were warriors roaming in the southern areas of Sydney in groups of 400, raiding and killing settlers. Now, Macquarie knew he couldn't have that in his backyard if he was to secure that road across the Blue Mountains and to connect with Bathurst. A single road across Aboriginal terrain in control of by warriors was just, unthinkable for Macquarie. Which also leads me, just for a quick post-Sydney Wars mention, was that element too has also led me to begin my next project, which is looking at the Bathurst War, where Windradine's resistance occurs against the settlers west of the mountains. And the reason I'm going on to that project is because of these connections, where Macquarie pushes the first invasion into Wiradjuri country across the mountains in 1815. And what happens after that. And the connections are really very obvious and strong. Now, landscape is a really heritage landscapes and landscape and non-heritage or non-built landscape is critical in understanding history, in my view. One of the reasons I wrote the Sydney Wars is because I know Sydney so well. Over the next months, I'm travelling to Bathurst and the Central West to really get an understanding of the landscape of that region, because I think it's critical in understanding its histories. Now, this is an historic homestead just south of Sydney called Beulah. You may have been there. It's the original buildings. They're not exactly certain. But possibly around 1820s. It has a. It struck me. I went out to the Appin area to look around at some of these heritage landscapes, not expecting much, and also out on a journey that was kind of, at the time, 2 years ago at least, I was thinking this could be the last chance to see these locations in the way that they are, because that area is such an area under threat, although we seem to have some abeyance in the threat at the moment, which is great news. But those heritage landscapes, and they're incredible. This historic homestead Beulah, on a little closer inspection, struck me out at the rear of the building, and I don't have an image of that particular one, but at the rear of the stone building at the back, there is a rifle slit window. And that got me interested. I looked at the 400-page heritage report of the historic homestead, and there was 2 words about these rifle slit windows, possibly defensive ? In the 400-page heritage report. Now, it's, it got me thinking, and I'm like, okay, maybe they're just decorative, maybe they're ventilation in the form of military architecture. But then, traveling around Appin, I came across 5 more buildings with rifle slit windows within a couple of kilometres radius, all on local 1810s farmsteads, which were neighbouring and on hillsides, on the top of hills. So now I'm still trying to work on investigating this, and I'll be looking at this kind of what I'm suggesting is a frontier war landscape in the Bathurst area as well. But the common factors of these buildings, potentially the outbuildings, the granaries, and they were used as granaries. We know that, but with rifle slit windows, I'm sure that there was a defensive element in mind in those constructions. This was a common architectural practice right across the British colony in places such as Jamaica, all around the world in the British Empire. And it's now, there's books about it called domestic defensive architecture. You build a strong house just in case. And in the colony, in the early colony, there's multiple examples of British government buildings being built with several purposes in mind: guarding convicts, guarding against convict attack, guarding against external French or whoever attack, and guarding against resistance warfare attacks. And I'm pretty sure that these buildings were either built with that in mind at the time, or in the 1820s with that fresh in the settlers' minds, because Aboriginal people around that area were still very, very prominent well into the 1830s. And I'll just show you, that's that building. And so there you can see that there is more going on there than just air ventilation. These are classic gun loops. Still, the jury's out on that, and there's more research and work to be done on that. Now, if I turn briefly to this chart of Port Jackson from William Bradley's log of the Sirius, 1788, and that Rosalind just mentioned, and I hope that many of the friends are familiar with from Rosalind's great work. As Rosalind mentioned, this came into the museum, the National Maritime Museum's hands, from descendants of the Bradley family, just after I'd published the Sydney Wars. But it's inspiring because it shows that there's still elements of history and just snippets of research still out there, even in this period we think that is so well covered. So this chart was Bradley's early draft in his personal logbook. Logbooks are pretty boring. The rest of it I find as boring as the proverbial. But this chart was interesting because this was the basis of Hunter's chart and the later published charts and maps that we all know of Sydney Harbour. But there's all these names on it that didn't get into, that I'd never seen before. They were on no one else's charts. And there's one that jumps out, and that was Bloody Point. And for me, it was really, you know, just an amazing moment where I suddenly worked out, well, this has to be the incident that Bradley's only there for before he goes to Norfolk Island for a certain amount of time, and he notes in his journal, which is in the State Library, about the events of the 2 rush cutters who were killed, and I'm sure that this is what where he's referring to, and that's Bloody Point. Now, if you look at that today, you'll see where Callan Park is, just across the way there. And I kind of pointed it towards the UTS Rowers Club roughly, but anyway, that point, Dog Rod Point, is where Bloody Point was, and that's where the account, which initially historians thought was at Rushcutters Bay because it's called Rushcutters Bay, but it was actually written down, recorded as up the harbour, not down the harbour from Sydney Cove, and this site is in my mind almost certainly the site where the 2 rush cutters were killed, and this is the accounts of Oakey and Davis who were killed there. The importance for me of this moment is that it connects up several things, and one of those things is it's the location of the start of Australia's first punitive military expedition, led personally by Governor Phillip, who goes to the site and says, "These people, Wongal people, whoever did it, they can't go unpunished. We have to find the people who killed these 2 convicts, and God knows what, teach them a lesson." And it's the same kind of rhetoric that goes on in you know, all the governors after Phillip. When there's murders of the colonists, there must be an equal punishment, if not more, to teach them a lesson, to strike terror into the population, basically, so they won't do it again. So Phillip leads an expedition off on a march from Bloody Point, ends up going towards Botany Bay, doesn't find anyone, of course, and then stumbles across a group of 200 warriors plus women and children, and there's a party of 12 or 15 or so Europeans. And you know, history could have changed radically without Governor Phillip that day, but they were allowed to pass back to the colony. And the day after, Governor Phillip issues orders that no one shall go from now on shall go outside the encampment of Sydney Cove without either escort of soldiers or without firearms. So I think it's a really important moment and a really important location that kind of connects to Callan Park. The other, and what I probably should finish up, the other element that I wanted to point out in terms of these landscapes that kind of, this one's more particular, but those campaigns are all around Sydney Harbour, and those accounts. Bradley's journal is I find fascinating. His journal, if you get to look at it, seems to be the most honest. He's a junior officer. He's not writing for a publication back in England, and he's rather circumspect. So his account's quite good. He documents every instance of conflict and engagement that he's witnessed to and hears about from other First Fleeters. So his account is, I think, really good to read, and I did an analysis of it, and it clearly shows the gradual. If you look at that, what would you call it? Cultural contact moments of contact between Europeans and Aboriginal people around Sydney in 1788. You see the progressive growth of conflict right through 1788, clearly in Bradley's journal, and in others, but very clearly in Bradley's journal. Bradley leaves the colony. That conflict grows and grows. There's an increasing amount of conflict moments rather than cooperation or exchange moments that grow throughout 1788. The thing that stops it, that changes everything, is the smallpox epidemic of April 1789. And that is a landscape that Callan Park shares with all the rest of Sydney Harbour, a landscape of where the settlers were finding dead bodies in every nook and cranny around the edges of Sydney Harbour. We don't know, obviously we don't know the numbers. The estimates are between 50 to 80% of the Sydney population died in that 2-month period. But the scenes are that the Europeans had to go out and bury bodies. So I think, sorry for, it's a bit of a, it's not a Sunday afternoon in light conversation, but I think it's really important that we tend to gloss over the fact that Sydney Harbour, the wonderful Sydney Harbour that we have today, the foreshores of Sydney Harbour, are built upon this. Now, I'm not sure if I've gone over time, but yeah, I just wanted to add that to see the connections of place, locality, heritage, and landscape that are united by history. I think it gives us a better, broader understanding of the past in our local places and how it fits into bigger national stories. So I'll end up with that. Thank you.
Gosh, Stephen, thank you. I could have sat listening for the rest of the afternoon. There's a great deal there about that resonates for Callan Park: broad histories, asset economics, and we're beset by the landscape structure plan, a different kind of landscape view. But certainly all those words resonate for us right now. Sarah, some of you may have heard Sarah speak at previous History Week events, and we're very grateful to her coming again today. Sarah is a writer and teacher, and also in 2018 she published her book, Callan Park Hospital for the Insane. Her next book, about the nautical school ships, the Vernon and the Sobraon, is titled wonderfully, Like a Wicked Noah's Ark. So inviting to learn more about that, and that book is due to be published next month. Sarah too has been very generous, as was Stephen, but Sarah in a different way, with the leading tours of the site regularly on behalf of Friends of Callan Park. And before the pandemic, we anticipated yet again that we would participate in History Week, and Sarah was lined up to conduct a tour. We'll be beginning those tours again, just not in quite the same numbers, but that will come, and we really appreciate Sarah's assistance. Today, Sarah will explore the relationship between Callan Park and these ships moored permanently at Cockatoo Island. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Rosalind. Thank you, Friends of Callan Park, for having me. I always appreciate the support that you all offer for my different projects, all sort of in the location of Callan Park. I think all of my projects will eventually sort of encircle the area. I'll have to find something on the other side of Roselle and Lilyfield. So if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. I'll just get my slides. Oh, so it's just like the school term all over again. It's quite frightening, the continuity. So what I'm going to speak about, as Rosalind hinted at, is trying to answer this question of history, what is it good for? Obviously, everyone's first answer is absolutely nothing, but trying to move beyond that. So I want to talk about people in history, particularly in the 19th century in Sydney, who we might regard as unusual subjects for history, people who dwell in the margins. I have a particular love of these people, I think bordering on obsession. So I'm going to talk about the patients at Callan Park, but also some of the boys on the Vernon. I've got a particular story of a family whose lives were touched by both institutions, and I'll talk about that in the second half of my presentation. I think that one of the points that Stephen made at the start of his presentation is about the fact that communities are wrapped in human memory. I think that not only really appeals to me as a historian, but also to someone who's interested in these marginalised groups, that perhaps these people who dwell in the margins of history today, who sometimes are awkward people in history, you know, they might be lunatic patients who we're not quite sure how to manage their stories. You know, there are all kinds of problems with writing about the mentally ill in any era, questions of bias, gaps in sources, things like that make it very difficult to write about. But not just lunatic patients, to use the 19th century term, also criminals, boys who were, in terms of this presentation, institutionalized and kept in what we would regard as a very old-fashioned institution en masse. You know, as 21st century people, we have a lot of questions about the nature of institutions and how efficacious they could really be. And this is something that's been very much interesting me in writing about Callan Park and also the industrial school ships Vernon and Sobraon. I think sometimes there's a tendency to sanitise some of these histories or entirely to forget them. It's of great interest to me that both of these institutions tend to be footnotes in other histories. And I'm very interested in exposing some of the stories as best one possibly can of people who lived sometimes 150 years ago. But I think that this is the answer. What is history good for? Remembering people who might not otherwise have been remembered because they are those awkward moments in history. So what I'm going to do is talk about the relationship between Callan Park and the nautical school ships. I think we all know quite a lot about Callan Park, being here at a Friends of Callan Park history event. So I'm going to spend probably a little bit more explaining exactly what these nautical school ships were. I think that there are three main aspects of the relationship that I want to explore between Callan Park Hospital for the Insane and these industrial school ships. And that's pointing out that they have a very close relationship spatially, but also politically. Henry Parkes was heavily involved in both, and also historically for the reasons I've just been speaking about. Two beautiful pictures of both institutions. I particularly like that one of Callan Park. I love the birdcage at the front near the stairs. I think that's a beautiful humanising element of the institution. And then on the right, we have one of the pictures from the early nautical school ship Vernon. You can see the boys lined up there in their sailors' uniforms and some of the staff at the front. One of them, the one on the left next to the little boy, he's the bugler, calling everyone to their different lessons and chores and things. If you look very carefully, you can see the captain standing way at the back, pretending he's not there. And that's typical of that particular man, but we'll get to that. Won't get ahead of ourselves. I think that we already know quite a lot about Callan Park. We know that the Gary Owen House, which is currently Writing New South Wales and hopefully, possibly, will stay that way. Good luck writing New South Wales, I feel for you, or anyone here is associated with that institution. So we have Gary Owen House that was bought in 1874 by the New South Wales state government as a precursor to the big hospital for the insane that they were planning on building. Gary Owen House itself is an interesting building. It was used first as the original hospital, and then as time went on, it became a semi-private ward for semi-private patients. So it's actually quite an interesting house. It's in terms of just the hospital even. It would be a shame to have anything happen to that house. I have to handcuff myself to the door, I think, if anyone wanted to do anything to that house. sure I'll get some time off work to do that. And then on the right of this slide, we have the magnificent Curtbridge complex, which was opened at in the second half around September of 1844. We all know the story about that, designed by James Barnett, the colonial architect, and Dr. Frederick Norton Manning, the Inspector General of the Insane. The site was particularly chosen because it was calm, it was near the water, there was a hell of a lot of land there, a lot of scope for building and quarrying the sandstone. So we all know about that. I won't dwell on that too much. Fabulous picture. Again, I quite like the two little men down the bottom of that one, sitting in the courtyard of Gary Owen House near the tree, relaxing. Lovely picture. Always worth the time to zoom in. Computers are good. So what I want to do is compare Callan Park to the nautical school ship Vernon and Sobraon. So to give you some information, because I found it quite interesting when I started my research about this institution, to find out exactly what it was and more particularly what it wasn't. So on the left-hand side, we have a picture of the actual ship Vernon. In its early time, it was moored near Garden Island, and it was moved a couple of years later, so in the early 1870s, to Cockatoo Island, and that's where it stayed. The institution was there until 1911. So this is quite a big institution, a very long-living one, I suppose, in terms of Sydney's colonial history. What the nautical school ship was a place where boys could be sent if their families weren't looking after them. So what Henry Parkes did in 1866 was he had a piece of legislation called the Industrial Schools Act, and that act enabled the police to arrest boys and girls, but we're focused on boys just for the minute, boys who were guilty of a range of very specific crimes. Now, those crimes are not crimes that we would today recognise as something that would land you in jail. They're things like being homeless, or not having an occupation, or simply just wandering the streets. With no ostensible occupation is the particular term. Things like sleeping out in the open air were also a crime under the Industrial Schools Act. So local police from not just Sydney, but all over New South Wales would arrest children for these crimes. You can imagine a lot of police knew these children quite well. This was a reason to take them into custody. They would be charged under the Industrial Schools Act, and then they would be taken to a magistrate who ideally, mostly, would inquire into the boy's family and actually find out if he was just a truant, if he actually had no family, if he was a beggar, if he did have a family, were they actually incapable of looking after him, or even worse, were they neglecting him? And if the answer was yes to those questions, the boy would be taken onto the nautical school ship. There was no such thing as a term of imprisonment. It was not a jail, like a lot of people assume, and I'll speak to that in a minute. But boys would be taken on board as long as they were over 7 years of age. They would be kept on board for at least a year, sometimes a little bit longer. It depended how they were going. They would go to school each day, so compulsory schooling, which was probably better than a lot of children who weren't being neglected on shore. So they had daily lessons, a lot of recreation, exercise, they went on trips, they had a lot of chores. You can imagine the kind of washing this sort of institution would accumulate. And they would stay there for about a year, maybe a year and a half, and then they would be apprenticed somewhere out in New South Wales, ideally not in the city where, if they'd been part of a gang previously, their old friends, in inverted commas, would be. So ideally out in the country, and they would be apprenticed there until they were 18. So for some boys, that could have been an apprenticeship of several years, maybe even 10. And after that, all of the money that they'd earned from their apprenticeship was then, which had been kept in a bank account for them, was then paid out. The idea was that you would create capable adult citizens out of the criminal classes, or boys who probably wouldn't have been educated, probably wouldn't have learnt a trade. And what you got when they were 18 was someone who did have a trade, who had connections, rural connections, maybe even had still kept in contact with their family, but most importantly, sometimes a great deal of money, which a lot of these boys use to set themselves up, sometimes with their own business, sometimes in a farm, or those sorts of things. Now, what it wasn't was a prison. And this is what my book deals with quite significantly, that throughout its history, from 1867 to 1911, there were these constant questions about these boys being definitely criminal. You know, you're not criminal if you have no home. Just because you've been begging on the streets or sleeping under a piece of zinc in Redfern, as one boy was, does not mean that you are criminal and dangerous. And throughout this institution's history, there was this incredible tension. Were these boys criminal and nasty? Were they being herded together where they would meet their criminal friends of the future? Was this ship, this institution, a maker of criminals? Were we manufacturing criminals? So this was the tension, just like some of the tensions in other state-run institutions of the time, which I'll speak about in a minute. The institution itself had quite an interesting history. We have the 3 captains, so only 3 captains for its entire life. Even after the Vernon was replaced by the much bigger ship Sobraon, we only had 3 captains, and 2 of them were on board for almost all of the time. The first one on your left, Captain Main, probably a drunk, bad choice of principal for a school of troubled boys. He had made some questionable decisions, this captain, but he also had pet monkeys that ran around on deck. So everyone has a redeeming factor. The middle one, my personal favourite, if one is allowed to have a personal favourite, Captain Nathansdane. Probably too difficult for the boys to pronounce. He was called Dutchy for a lot of his career. And after he finished being a tremendously good organiser and understander of adolescents on these ships, he became the Comptroller General of Prisons in New South Wales. I'd like to think he didn't meet too many of the boys again in prison. He spent a lot of his career checking the figures out. And the last one, Captain Mason, who was quite a brave man. Am I allowed to say you'll have to read my book to find out, or is that too outrageous? These are our 3 captains. So good, moderately good, excellent, and also excellent. The first man left a bit to be desired, but again, he'd been attacked and poisoned by people in his life. I like to think he wasn't in his right mind. So what I would like to talk about in terms of these 2 wonderful Sydney institutions full of these awkward subjects for history, are there similarities and their connections? The first one that we cannot miss is the fact that spatially these 2 are very, very close. Parramatta River between them, Cockatoo Island being such a central part of this area of Sydney. Callan Park and both the Vernon and Sobraon boys were all very, very keen cricket players. The Vernon boys spent a lot of time touring around, playing different schools and also other government institutions. Always on boats, rowing here, there and everywhere over the harbour. It feels like something from a Boys' Own annual. Some of the things they got up to, fishing at Balmoral, rounders at Lane Cove, you name it, they were there playing sport. I think it highly likely, even though I don't have any definite evidence, that these patients met these boys playing cricket. There are occasionally references to Vernon boys in Callan Park annual reports, but never specifically about cricket, but I think it very, very likely given the proximity. Both institutions were deliberately placed so that they could be making the most of the harbour, obviously for some very different reasons. Callan Park patients were there for therapeutic reasons. Vernon boys were there to learn how to be decent individuals, shall we say, given their mixed backgrounds. So very close spatially, but also politically. Henry Parkes was absolutely integral to bringing all of these different asylums to Sydney, particularly Callan Park. Very much integral to the process, worked very closely with Manning in making decisions about the building sometimes, but also wanting updates and wanting to know how efficacious it was. Also regarded as the father of the Vernon. It was Henry Parkes who was interested in mimicking some of the ideas that were being used in Britain at the time. And I think that we can absolutely think of the Vernon and Sobraon as sort of Henry Parkes' spin on naval training ships in England. Naval training ships tended to be slightly different. They weren't 100% state-owned institutions, a lot of them in England, and they tended to be specifically geared at creating mariners rather than terrestrially based tradesmen. I suppose that's one of the ironies of these ships. They created very few sailors, but that wasn't the point. So both of these institutions, so again on the left we have some of the warders at Callan Park, some of the male attendants in 1903, and then on the right hand side we have a photo taken of the Vernon boys outside Hampton Villa in Balmain, which was at a party hosted by Henry Parkes. You can see in the middle, the tallest man in the back row, that's my favourite, Captain Nightingale. Quite a frightening figure, I think. Perhaps that's why he was so successful. The boys sitting on the ground in their sailors' uniforms, these were some of the boys who were trusted to do extra chores and have leadership roles on board the ship. So something that Captain Mayne, the first captain, didn't really think about. He wasn't very good at anticipating teenage boys and how much more attached to an institution that they might be if they actually had a role, a designated role. And the second captain instituted that these boys sitting down got to have extra privileges so that some of them were paid. They did night watch, they could use the library, they could go on errands on shore, and they promised to come back. And these ones did. So we have two institutions which are very close spatially. They're very, very closely related politically, both, I suppose, some of the brainchilds of Henry Parkes. Both institutions seen as quite dark, I think, by 21st century historians. There's always this implication of abuse in both of them, in terms of mentally ill people, but then also children, orphans, criminal boys. You know, there's always this suspicion, what was going on at night? It might interest you to know that mainly the suspicions that were ever inquired to on the Vernon and Sobraon related to boys attacking each other rather than the staff, which to 21st century ears seems rather bemusing, I suppose. So both are regarded as dark, both perhaps tinged with abuse, be it physical, sexual or mental, and they're very difficult to write about as a result. What I would like to do now is talk about my specific family. This family is actually the catalyst for my book about the Vernon and Sobraon. While I was researching Callan Park, I came across a family who the father of this family was at Callan Park, and his son was referred to in a newspaper article as a Vernon boy. And I thought, what on earth is a Vernon boy? And it took me a while, but I found out. And so here is their story. It was a man named John Burton Cox, who in Callan Park's very early history, when Curtbridge didn't exist and Gary Owen House was the only hospital, it had an extra ward, a weatherboard ward built on the side, which is long gone now. It was roughly in the place of the car park at Riding, New South Wales. John Burton Cox, even though he's perhaps a member of the marginalised group of history, before he came to Callan Park, I think it's important to point out, he was a normal person. He had a life. He had a wife and several children. They originally lived in Melbourne, where some of those children were born, and he owned his own building business. He was a contractor. He used to make bricks and build buildings, so he was actually quite successful. He started in the very early 1880s, having some very strange delusions of grandeur. He became very, very violent, and he had several stints in different hospitals for the insane. So at the time when he was ill, Callan Park had only just opened, and before that he had been at Parramatta Hospital for the insane and also Gladesville for the insane. His wife had brought him in several times before. When he came to Callan Park, he was particularly violent, and he was at that time assumed to be acting strangely because he was suffering from the general paralysis of the insane. A wonderful title, but also a disease that we recognise today as tertiary syphilis, and a serious mental disease. While he was at Callan Park, he destroyed furniture, he broke windows. He was very difficult to deal with. His wife would come and visit him quite frequently. She used to make claims that her husband was being ill-treated. The staff would see him fighting with other patients. He gave one a black eye, and it was put down to the scuffles that he was in, why he was also bruised. But he was a person before he was a patient, and when he died, his family mourned him, just like we would expect. He's in some ways an awkward member of history, and in others not. One of his sons, Tommy Cox, who was one of the children born in Victoria, was only 10 years old when his father died. Here's a picture of Tommy. And like a lot of the boys on the Vernon, who had similar instances of grief in their life, a huge number of these boys on these ships had no father, whether through death or through desertion. A lot of them lacked a father figure. Tommy fell in with a bad crowd, again, like so many on the Vernon. There's significant evidence that he joined a gang or a push called the Marrickville Push while he was living in the inner west with his family. And eventually he was picked up by the police, again, under the Industrial Schools Act. Hanging around with a gang and not going home absolutely counted as a reason to arrest a boy like Tommy. While he was on the ship, he was looked after by Captain Nightingale, who was very strict. I can't see Tommy sitting back at a garden party at Hampton Villa as one of those special boys who was picked out for leadership roles. He was quite a nasty boy, and also quite a nasty adult. While he was on board, he was quite troublesome. He was one of a very small number of boys who tried to escape the Vernon while it was moored beside Cockatoo Island. Now, this is one of the points of being on a ship. It was very difficult to escape. And it's one of the reasons why the Vernon lost so few boys, either through death or escape or other means. But Tommy jumped into the water one day with some of his friends and they tried to swim to the shore. Now, that's quite a swim. And he was pulled unconscious from the water. They were seen diving into the water. He was unconscious, he was not breathing, and he was resuscitated and brought back to life. Lucky Tommy. Now, he repaid this fateful moment while he was out on apprenticeship by escaping several times. Now, it's not hard to escape an apprenticeship. You just walk out. If you have a master who is a little bit quick-witted, you might walk out of his property at night. It's not a difficult thing, not like swimming across Sydney Harbour one day. He escaped twice from his apprenticeship and eventually fled to Taree. That was a good place to go if you were a Vernon boy trying not to go back. Children were quite frequently recovered from where they were hiding in Sydney slums and were generally brought back to the ship. So Tommy was always quite a good escape artist, as you will see again in a moment in his adult life. He spent quite a while after he was 18 years old, again, part of that Marrickville push. Quite a nasty character, liked to assault random members of the public, particularly stealing things from them. Big fan of attacking Chinese people as well. A really unpleasant person, but apparently also quite charismatic. He had a very loyal following in his gang of particularly younger boys who he kept on quite a tight leash. There are some instances of them lying in court to protect him. Quite charismatic, maybe perhaps a little bit like his unwell father. He was eventually sentenced to 7 years jail in Berrima, and he was incredibly badly behaved. A lot of the jail punishment books don't exist anymore at state archives. The indexes do, but the books that hold the details don't. And Tommy absolutely is in those indexes, in those books. I would love to know how he was punished. I'm sure he was flogged quite frequently. After he got out of jail, he married a poor girl who I think probably regretted the connection. He forced her into prostitution, very violent as an adult. And perhaps what is most interesting for us is that he became a champion lightweight boxer, which is why he's one of the significant case studies in my book. He was the lightweight champion of Western Australia for quite a while. I would suggest that this was bad for all of New South Wales. We did not need Tommy Cox to know how to punch more accurately or with any more vigour. But this absolutely happened. Now, Tommy Cox was always a very violent person, very much like his father. He seemed to lack judgment. And one day, when he returned to New South Wales, still a boxer, still very strong, very frightening, he attacked a small child in Sydney. He was arrested almost instantly by the police, but he managed to give them the slip, and he was a stowaway on a steamer, and he, as a fugitive, he arrived in America. Now, the reason that we know this is that Tommy I do think about them in the present tense. Tommy decided that it would be absolutely appropriate to start to let Australian newspapers know that he was still okay. Lots and lots of headlines in the 1900s where Tommy Cox thought that people would like to know how he was going. And also give some tips about boxing. In this second one, he was worried that everyone thought he might have died. So he thought he would confirm that he was alive and well. He gave a few tips about some American boxers coming to Australia. I had a difficult time in America, shall we say, a very a lot of continuity in his life, shall we put it like that. I do like that he's a ruffian that goes to jail. I think this is probably my favourite headline. Writes chattily of himself and American matters. His letters actually go on and on and on. He talks about the special new summer house he bought on Long Island, how he's still a boxer, how now he's not a boxer and now he's a pedagogue. He really is quite a person, is Tommy Cox. I also like this one. He was, you won't be surprised, stabbed in the throat by someone, but he wrote again to the referee, one of Sydney's sporting periodicals, to let everyone know that he was recovering quite well. So perhaps a bit delusional, like his father. Am I allowed to say that? I hope that's okay. But we have two really awkward people here. We have not only John Burton Cox, who, you know, we hear his story after it's been pieced together and we immediately think, you know, was he being badly treated when he was at Gary Owen House in that first incarnation of Callan Park Hospital for the Insane, with those bruises on his arms that his wife was asking about? Were they manhandling by attendants, or was it true that he was the one who was attacking other patients? You know, we're very suspicious of that as 21st century historians. And the same goes for his son. Was Tommy Cox, was he a damaged individual before or after he got to the Vernon? Was he the abused or the abuser? Absolutely a product of war culture and slum living. But he's one of the groups in history who is marginalised. Even in the writing of my history, I've had people suggest to me that my book is not a proper topic for a historian to be writing about, that there is an inherent bias in the sources that are left to us that is just absolutely impossible to overcome. And I would argue that it's always worth having a look to see what you can find, that leaving no historical stone unturned is probably a better attitude to have than putting things in the too hard basket. I think that when we ask what history is good for, we should absolutely jump on that and say that it's good for shining a light on these people who are very difficult to write about. That Tommy Cox's story sounds terrible. It sounds like he was a felon, a very dangerous man, with an ego the size of, wow. But does that mean that we should not write about him? That would be my question. If I may, Friends of Callan Park, I'd like to end with a shameless advertisement. And perhaps Rosalind, if anyone has any questions.
Sarah, that was just wonderful. I'm really sorry that you've both finished speaking, frankly. It's a wonderful afternoon. At first I thought this was going to be such a tricky way rather than managing the glory of meeting together in the flesh, but this has really been a wonderful tale of two finely grained stories and wonderful images, both of you. I particularly like the ships and the landscape in the background, and yours, Stephen, that wonderful map. I think you've really captured what must be a very complicated story in a single page map. I'm scouring down the side panel for the stories, and Hall Greenland has asked, obviously both amazing histories, and are there any earlier accounts of their subjects? I guess, Hall, that's directed to Sarah.
Stephen, I know Stephen mentioned, I think it's Bradley's diaries, but I just wonder in both cases whether such such rich veins of history had been mined before, and what their own points of departure are as far as those earlier accounts, if they existed, is.
Stephen, would you like to address that?
Well, I don't think I can. If you mean, there's a set amount, there's a small number of early colonial diarists. That the paucity of archival records, historical records, is what I'm talking about as a non-Indigenous historian. Is it's not. There's a finite amount. Having said that, as I showed, the odd thing does pop up, and that's we still may find more documents that add to this picture over time in the dusty cupboards of the earls and whoever, I think, is where they'll be, but or at the bottom of someone's archival drawer. But there's no, I think I've covered everything that's known about those 1788 events anyway.
Thank you.
Sarah.
So Hall, did you want to know about previous historians who have written about Vernon and Sobraon?
Yeah, is there a whole historiography of the topic? Yeah.
Not very much. John Ramsland wrote a really important book called The Children of the Backlanes in the 1980s, and he has a couple of chapters on industrial schools generally, and specifically the Vernon and Sobraon. Because he's taken a step back, and he has an absolutely comprehensive study of lots of the child welfare institutions that were happening in Sydney at the time. So he looks at girls as well. So he's probably the main one. There have been quite a few PhD theses on a combination of the institutions, or specifically under one of the captains. So mine is the first to look at the whole institution in the context of other child welfare institutions, but very specifically these two ships. I talk about the girls a little bit. Girls were not treated as nicely in this era. The boys had thousands of pounds spent on them on their ships, and the girls, for some time, were just in the dingy old convict barracks on the top of Cockatoo Island. Fallen girls were seen as much more difficult to reclaim by civilised society than boys.
Maybe if I could just add, I think I might have missed Hal's point about historiography, because in Marrickville at the moment there's a guy popping monos on his motorbike in my street. But in terms of historiography, I think the important thing for me is, Hal, that the frontier wars hasn't been treated by military historians in Australian history at all, pretty much. Like it's rare. There's John Connor and a couple of others. It's been swamped by post-1901 conflicts, and it's the same with Australian larger historical memory of war and conflict. Those frontier war battles and wars have almost been erased, if not forgotten, at the expense of modern warfare. And that's like serious military history. Frontier wars is not serious military history. And I think that's been a real failing of many historians.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think that's one of the benefits of today, and the History Council's question and the value of history. There are two questions I'd like to conflate here. Sarah, one person asks, did the ships sail very much, or were they stationary and docked most of the time? And also, where were the photographs that you showed? I think you actually had those footnoted, but perhaps you might speak to that.
Yeah. So the ships first, the ships didn't sail anywhere. They weren't capable of that. So permanently moored with great big anchors to the seafloor in Sydney Harbour. When they were moved, when they needed to undergo maintenance, things like that, they had to be towed to Fitzroy Dock on Cockatoo Island. So actually, it's sort of ironic, incapable of actually going anywhere. The reason that ships were chosen, because that's such an expensive way to house anyone, just because of the maintenance needed. The rationale initially, from Henry Parkes's point of view in 1866, was that the Vernon would just be the first of many industrial schools for boys that would be opened in New South Wales. He had a vision of opening some more terrestrial ones where agriculture and other trades could be taught, and that the boys who went on the Vernon would be not only robust enough, to use the term, to become sailors, but also might be the ones that needed the greatest security around their incarceration. But just a few years into the Vernon's history, it was realised that there actually weren't the numbers that they were anticipating, and so plans for any of the land-based institutions were canned, and that's why one of many reasons why the ship was anchored permanently at Cockatoo Island, so that farming and other trades like woodwork could be carried out adjacent to the ship on the island. As time went on, in the 1890s and early 1900s, as the Sobraon by that time was increasingly being viewed as sort of too public, being out in the middle of the harbour, the state government opened the Mittagong Boys' Home, or farm home, out in the Southern Highlands, and that was eventually one of the destinations where boys would be sent when the Sobraon was disbanded. The other one was Mount Penang Boys' Home, which was opened when the Sobraon closed in 1911 and 1912. So the plan initially was to create sailors from the Vernon, but it just didn't happen. There weren't enough boys. In terms of the pictures, so that famous image of the boys manning the yards, which is also the cover for my book, that's held by many institutions. It was a really common image from the time. The State Library holds it, National Maritime Museum holds one, lots and lots of institutions have that one. The others are a mixture from the New South Wales State Records Authority and other pictures that the State Library and the Powerhouse Museum hold in their collections. There are quite a lot of pictures associated with this institution, and also some of the boys individually, which is a bit special, I think.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't know if you can see Signals magazine from the Maritime Museum. There was a very interesting article about the ships a couple of issues back, 1 or 2 issues back. And of course, Sarah's book will be out next month if publication is on schedule. There's a link I might just draw your attention to on the questions from David Roth, who did his PhD about Callan Park, and there's a link to his open research PhD thesis there. Thank you, David, for that. And Anne Reynolds has highlighted an article that Tommy Cox has written to the referee. And Richard White, who's also online, has asked, were there any boys on the Vernon from Indigenous families? And Henry Parkes's interest in mental health and in welfare suggests that he was genuinely well motivated. Do you agree? And any other comments about Henry Parkes? Now, we could have a whole session about Henry Parkes, so could you limit it slightly?
No problem. To answer the first question, were there Indigenous boys on the Vernon? the Vernon's entrance books, we do not have the complete series left to us. There is a big gap around Captain Nakenstein's early tenure. It runs for several years. Aside from that gap, there are no boys that I have seen in these entrance books, and there are thousands and thousands of boys who went through these ships. None of them that I have ever seen has been labelled Indigenous. I would be wary of saying that there were no Indigenous boys. There is one in my book who unfortunately falls into that gap in the sequence, who was referred to as Larry, an Aboriginal, who was out on apprenticeship, and he got into some trouble and was taken to court for a little while, and he is clearly stated in a newspaper report at the time to have been a Vernon boy, but again, I can't check that with the entrance book. So my impression is yes, there was never any picking and choosing of boys. These were not cherry picked. If they were arrested and charged correctly, then they were on board the ship. So a difficult question to answer, but perhaps at least one. Difficult to triangulate though. I would say I'm a fan of Henry Parkes. I know some people aren't. I think that absolutely he was well-intentioned. I think he was well-motivated in the research for Callan Park, and like a wicked Noah's Ark, I have seen many handwritten notes from Henry Parkes genuinely inquiring in terms of how people are genuinely interested in how his institutions, if I can put it like that, were faring. Even in 1880, when the Colonial Secretary released control of the Vernon and it was passed to the Department of Education, or what we would say is the Department of Education today, there is some suggestion that he did that to protect the institution rather than letting it fall into the hands of the villainous State Children's Relief Department. So I would say that yes, from my perspective and the research I've done, yes, that he was genuinely well motivated. I'm sure though that some people would be able to cite examples of shady dealings and things like that.
Thank you, Sarah. There's one question further, and then I'd like to come to a question for Stephen. But Kerry has asked that you mention an early sporting magazine, and what was the name of that?
It was either, just off the top of my head, the Sydney Sportsman, or it might have been the Referee. He wrote to both. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you can, they'll all be on Trove, I'm sure.
Thank you, Sarah. A question, Stephen, for you. I was intrigued about your explorations around the outskirts of Sydney to Beulah and so on, and I wondered what how you did that. Did you go formally onto the properties or just sort of creep around, and what the response has been to your reassessment? And I think, Sarah, you might have to stop sharing your screen. Is that? Would that share screen and we can see Stephen?
No, that's okay. I think it's it's just on who's talking.
Yes. Sorry.
I got the first part of your question. A bit of both is the answer: lurking, sneaking, and formally. What was the second part, Rosalind?
I wondered what the response was for entities like the Heritage Council. Are they welcoming your reassessment of some of these historic statements? 400-page conservation management plan?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure. I haven't had any formal feedback, but the Heritage Council, I think, is aware of these things, and I'm sure it's well, I've been contacted as part of the Southwest Koala Park and Mount Gilead development. So I think I actually think it's really interesting that these kinds of histories are being connected with environmental campaigns. I've been contacted by environmental campaigners, and I think it's something that has been in the past perhaps missing, that adds a lot to any particular campaign for heritage, landscape, parklands, whatever.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, here's a question from Hall. Has there been any feedback from conventional military historians, Stephen?
Yes. Conventional. What's conventional? From some, such as Peter Stanley, who's, would you say he's conventional? In some ways, yes, but he's very open-minded, and has always campaigned for example, the Australian War Memorial, talking about pre-1901 military history. So yes, and there's some. What I'm really inspired by at the moment is there seems to be, just in the last couple of years. Sorry if you can hear that aeroplane. There's an aeroplane. It's amazing. It's weird, isn't it? It's like it's become a nice sound. It's so irregular now. There's some historians doing similar kinds of work all around the country. Henry Reynolds called for this 20 years ago and said, he's done the big picture stuff, and we need to look at local places and campaigns and resistance in different nations around, Indigenous nations. And it hadn't really happened until the last few years, where historians, non-Indigenous historians, have taken up that call. And there's now in Queensland, there's a few: Timothy Bottoms, Ray Kirchhoff. But I'm really excited. There's also Angus Murray, who is a Wiradjuri military historian. And now we're starting to see a real strong presence of Indigenous and non-Indigenous historians. And that's, it's about time. It's great. So, yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. That's really thrilling. It must be thrilling for you, as having been part of the forefront as well of that. I know Reynolds much earlier, but one question has come in from Faye about the engravings of the sailing ships on the sandstone rocks at Callan Point within Callan Park, and she's assuming that they connected with the Vernon. I've got some thoughts about that, but perhaps I might pass first to Sarah, if you've come across that in any way.
Rosalind, I think you know more about that than me. Feel free to keep going.
Those rock carvings, we're really not sure whether they are done by a patient at Callan Park or a mariner who was moored in Iron Cove or nearby. And the other layer is that they may be, there's lots of contemporary modern Western symbols there, but whether some of those carvings were there originally made by Aboriginal people and then utilised and carved over. But I think I'd like to come back to that on another occasion, perhaps, because that's a vexed story in many ways, with a vexed recent and vexed and tragic history more recently. There's just a question from Elizabeth for you, Stephen, about the Cumberland Plain Conservation Plan, whether you're aware of that, and I'll just turn myself.
Look, no, I'm not, and I look forward to looking at it. Actually, thank you, Elizabeth.
And again, another comment from Faye. One of her great-grandfathers was at North Lodge during the 1890s and involved with setting up the farm there. Are there records or liaison with the Vernon and Callan Park? I'm not aware of what the North Lodge is, but does that have meaning for you, Stephen? No, sorry, that's really Sarah's asking about. It's a really question for Sarah, sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm not sure what the North Lodge is. Faye, can you provide some details? I'm not sure.
I wonder, is that a question that we could pass on, Faye, if you'd contact Friends of Callan Park on our email address, and we can perhaps put you in touch directly with Sarah. And I'd just like to bid farewell to Jamie Parker. Thank you, Jamie, for attending this afternoon. The numbers are down to 60, which I think is remarkable after this long chunk of time. And they've been up to 67. So I think it speaks to a great interest in both your presentations. I have to peer with my glasses, but yes, Lynn is looking forward to the book launch, and I'm sure we'll hear about that further. But I wonder whether, unless either of you, Sarah or Stephen, have something further to add, we might draw the afternoon to a close.
That's fine by me. Thank you so much, Rosalind. I actually have to go. I've got a dog that really wants a walk before dark. So
that's much more important.
That's great to finish now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Sarah?
Yes, thank you everyone for coming along. It's lovely to see just Zoom support of History Week.
It is indeed.
Yeah, so thank you for listening.
So I know we can't really audibly all clap, but I really want to thank you both so much for giving your time this afternoon. Thank you very much, and enjoy your dog walking. Goodbye.
Thank you.